The year is 1473 before Christ. The west bank of the Nile near Thebes. Dawnlight bleeds across the desert, turning sand the color of old blood. A woman named Henutmeyer stands barefoot on limestone, already hot enough to raise blisters. Her hands are bound behind her back with papyrus rope, so tight the fibers have embedded into swollen flesh. Around her neck hangs a wooden placard painted with hieroglyphics that spell out her crime. Adulteress. The word, in ancient Egyptian, carries weight that transcends simple translation. It means betrayer of Maat, the cosmic order that prevents reality from collapsing into chaos. It means polluter of bloodlines that connect pharaohs to gods. It means her existence now threatens the universe itself. 3 judges sit in the shade of a reed canopy, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks depicting Anubis, the jackal god who weighs hearts against feathers. They have already pronounced sentence. What happens next is not punishment in any modern sense. It is purification through suffering, restoration of cosmic balance through the systematic destruction of the body that dared to disrupt it. Henutmeyer is 22 years old, married to a mid-level scribe named Jehuti for 6 years, mother to 3 children who were removed from her home 2 days ago and told their mother died of fever. As far as Egyptian law is concerned, she did die. The moment the accusation was proven, she ceased to be a person with rights or identity or future. She became a vessel for demonstration, a living lesson about what happens when women forget that their bodies belong not to themselves, but to their husbands, their families, and ultimately to Pharaoh himself. The first punishment assigned to Henutmeyer is called the breaking of the nose. This is not metaphor. A specialized priest approaches carrying bronze tongs heated in a brazier until they glow dull red. The purpose is not immediate death, but permanent marking. In a culture where the afterlife requires an intact body for the soul's return, deliberate mutilation carries implications that extend beyond mortality. What they are about to do will follow her into eternity itself. She tries to turn her head away. 3 temple guards hold her immobile. The priest speaks a ritual formula asking Amun-Ra to witness that this punishment serves divine justice. Then he clamps the tongs onto her nose and tears cartilage from bone with a twisting motion that produces a sound. Witnesses will later describe as similar to ripping papyrus, but wetter. The pain is not the worst part. The worst part is understanding that this is only the beginning. The judges have assigned her to serve 15 days of purification through suffering before her final disposition. 15 days during which her body will be systematically altered to serve as warning to every woman in Thebes who might consider that her desires matter more than her duty. Here is what they never taught you in history class about ancient Egypt. You know about Cleopatra and Nefertiti, powerful queens who wielded influence across the ancient world. You know about the elaborate beauty rituals, the kohl-lined eyes, and golden jewelry. You have seen museum exhibits celebrating Egyptian civilization's sophistication, its advances in medicine and mathematics and engineering. You have encountered the romantic notion that ancient Egypt was relatively egalitarian, that women could own property and initiate divorce. But you have never learned about the systematic brutality reserved for wives accused of adultery. You have never discovered the specialized priests whose sole function was administering punishments so severe that Roman historians, arriving 1,000 years later, would struggle to believe Egyptian records were accurate. You have never heard about the legal framework that made a woman's body property to be damaged or destroyed at her husband's discretion. Tonight, you will learn why Egyptian medical papyri contain detailed instructions for treating injuries inflicted during adultery punishments, with physicians explicitly instructed to keep victims alive through suffering, but never to heal them completely. How accusations of adultery functioned as political weapons to destroy inconvenient women, with conviction rates above 98% regardless of actual guilt. What archaeological evidence reveals about the specialized punishment chambers built beneath temples, carved directly into bedrock, and designed for both practical function and theological messaging? why some women chose death over completing their sentences, with burial records showing unusual numbers of young women dying in the weeks before their final punishments were scheduled. How the techniques developed for controlling female sexuality influenced legal codes across the Mediterranean world for the next 3,000 years, creating templates that persist in recognizable forms, even today. If you want to understand how civilizations we celebrate as advanced could systematically torture women for exercising autonomy over their own bodies, hit that subscribe button right now, and comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the planet, connected across time and space by our shared need to understand how power operates when no one is watching. Let me take you back to the legal framework that made punishments like Hennetmeyer's not just permissible, but mandatory under Egyptian law. The foundation rested on the concept of ma'at, the cosmic order established at creation. Every action either supported or undermined ma'at. Female adultery was classified among the worst violations, comparable to tomb robbery or patricide, because it introduced uncertainty into bloodlines that connected living pharaohs to divine ancestors. But here is what makes Egyptian adultery law particularly insidious. The legal codes compiled during the Middle Kingdom specified different categories of adultery based on the wife's social status and the identity of her partner. A noblewoman who coupled with a slave committed a worse offense than a slave woman who coupled with a freeman, because hierarchical violation compounded the sexual transgression. The most serious offense was any woman coupling with a priest, because this polluted not just family bloodlines, but the sacred intermediaries between humans and gods. Evidence for adultery could be remarkably minimal. Egyptian legal papyri document cases where convictions resulted from nothing more than a neighbor claiming they saw a woman speaking too freely with a man not her husband. Physical evidence was not required. The testimony of 2 male witnesses was sufficient for conviction, while a woman's own testimony carried essentially no weight in adultery proceedings. She could not testify in her own defense. She could not call witnesses. She could not appeal. Once accused and convicted, she entered a legal category called the condemned, a status that stripped away all protections normally afforded even to slaves. Now contrast this with how Egyptian law treated male sexual behavior. A husband could have sexual relations with slaves, servants, or prostitutes without legal or social consequences. His wife could not even protest without risking accusation of disobedience, itself a punishable offense. But if she so much as spoke privately with a man not her husband, she could be accused of adultery. The asymmetry was total and deliberate. Egyptian legal philosophy held that men's sexual activities outside marriage did not threaten Ma'at because men could not be impregnated, thus no bloodline confusion resulted. Women's sexual activities outside marriage were cosmic violations because any resulting pregnancy would introduce uncertain lineage into families that might eventually connect to pharaonic succession. This reasoning appeared so rational to Egyptian jurists that they never questioned whether the premise itself was designed to give men total control over women's bodies while suffering no equivalent restrictions themselves. The punishments fell into 3 categories, each serving specific purposes. First came marking punishments, designed to make adultery permanently visible on the body. Second came suffering punishments, intended to purify the offender through endured pain while demonstrating to witnesses the consequences of violation. Third came final punishments, which ended the offender's life in ways that had implications for her eternal soul. The sophistication with which Egyptian authorities had categorized and systematized cruelty reveals something disturbing about human capacity to rationalize harm when institutional power provides justification. Hennetmeyer is experiencing the marking phase. After the nose mutilation, she is branded on both cheeks with a symbol indicating adultery. The brand is applied with a copper tool shaped like a broken heart hieroglyph, heated until it glows white. But the branding serves purposes beyond simple identification. It makes her crime visible to everyone she encounters. It prevents her from hiding in another city and remarrying under a false identity. Most critically, it marks her as available for public degradation, signaling that any citizen may insult or assault her without legal consequence. Egyptian legal philosophy held that shame could purify souls that physical pain alone could not reach. By making the crime permanently visible, authorities ensured that every human interaction for the rest of the victim's life would reinforce her status as violator of Ma'at. She would never escape the moment of her conviction. Every reflection in water, every face she met, every child who pointed and asked questions would remind her that she had been judged and found wanting. But marking was only the beginning. Hennetmeyer is taken from the public judgment square to a building adjacent to the Temple of Karnak. This structure appears in no tourist guides because it was deliberately excluded from temple complex maps when they were compiled for modern visitors. It exists 3 levels below the main temple courts, accessible only through a tunnel that descends at a sharp angle into bedrock. The Egyptians called it the House of Correction. Modern archaeologists who have explored it refer to it simply as the Adultery Chambers. The architecture reveals function with brutal efficiency. 15 small rooms branch off a central corridor. Each room is approximately 10 feet square, carved directly from stone, with a single oil lamp niche and iron rings set into walls at heights corresponding to a standing woman's wrists and ankles. The ceiling in each room is exactly 6 feet high, too low for a person to stand fully upright if they are taller than average, creating constant physical discomfort even when not being actively punished. There are no windows, no ventilation beyond what circulates through the corridor. The temperature is constant year-round, cool enough to make bare skin uncomfortable, but not cold enough to provide relief from the burning sensation of brands and wounds. In rooms like this, women served their purification sentences before final disposition. The suffering punishments administered here followed protocols specified in legal texts that have survived because they were copied and recopied for judicial training purposes across centuries. The standard purification for adultery took 15 days, divided into 3 5-day periods, each with escalating severity. Days 1 through 5 focused on hunger purification. The convicted woman was given water, but no food. This was not simple starvation, but calculated dietary manipulation. She received exactly enough water to prevent death from dehydration, measured carefully by priests, trained in keeping bodies alive through suffering. The hunger served theological purposes. Egyptian medical texts explained that the organs of digestion were linked to organs of reproduction through channels that carried humors throughout the body. Starving the digestive system was believed to purify the reproductive system, burning away the spiritual pollution that adultery had introduced. But there was a practical dimension, too. Modern medical understanding recognizes that starvation produces psychological effects that made victims more compliant for subsequent punishments. After 5 days without food, a person's resistance to pain and capacity for rebellion diminish significantly. Blood sugar crashes create confusion and weakness. The body begins consuming its own muscle tissue. Cognitive function deteriorates. The Egyptians may not have understood the biochemistry, but they recognized the pattern through observation. A starved woman was easier to control, less likely to resist, more willing to simply endure whatever came next, in hopes it might end. Days 6 through 10 introduced pain purification. This phase varied based on the specific circumstances of the adultery and the social status of those involved. For women like Hennetmeyer, wives of middle-status men who had been caught with partners of similar social rank, the standard pain purification involved systematic striking of the back and legs with reeds. This sounds almost mild compared to other ancient punishments, until you understand the technique. Egyptian pain purification was not about raw force, but about cumulative damage delivered with medical precision. The reed strikes were administered 3 times daily, 20 strikes per session, delivered by a specialized priest who had trained for years in hitting hard enough to cause severe pain and tissue damage, but not hard enough to break bones or cause immediate death from internal bleeding. The same spots were struck repeatedly day after day, preventing healing and creating layers of damaged tissue that physicians recognized would never fully recover. Medical papyri from Thebes contain instructions for treating women who had survived reed purification, noting that they typically developed chronic pain conditions that lasted for years and often prevented normal walking. The instructions specify that physicians should treat infections that might cause death, but should not provide treatments that would fully heal the damaged tissue. The scars were meant to be permanent, physical reminders that would hurt every time the woman moved for the rest of her life. Days 11 through 15 involved exposure purification. This final phase, before final disposition, required the convicted woman to be displayed publicly in the temple courtyard during the hottest part of each day. She stood bound to a wooden frame, positioned where the sun struck directly, her mutilated face and branded cheeks fully visible to anyone entering the temple complex. Guards prevented her from moving into shade. Priests offered her water irregularly, sometimes every hour, sometimes not for 6 hours, creating unpredictability that prevented her from psychologically preparing for relief. The goal was not just physical suffering from heat and thirst, but psychological breakdown from uncertainty and public humiliation. Temple records indicate that exposure purification was often the phase where women broke completely, accepting whatever final punishment was assigned because continued existence had become unbearable. Some women used these 5 days to try to convince passing priests or officials of their innocence, begging for mercy or review of their cases. Egyptian law did not permit such appeals, but hope dies slowly even under these conditions. Most begging was ignored. Occasionally, a priest would stop to explain to the pleading woman that her suffering served cosmic justice, that Ma'at required her purification, that her pain was necessary for universal order. These explanations were not cruelty for its own sake, but reflected genuine Egyptian theological belief. The priests who administered these punishments, who struck women with reeds and denied them shade, and explained that their suffering was cosmically necessary, genuinely believed they were serving divine justice. This makes their actions more disturbing, not less. Cruelty justified by theology is cruelty that can be perpetuated indefinitely, without guilt, rationalized as righteous service rather than recognized as the systematic torture it actually was. But before I tell you about the final punishments, about what happened to women like Kenneth Meyer after their 15 days of purification, I need you to understand who these women actually were. Because the historical record has been distorted by sources written exclusively by the authorities who punished them, we need to recover, as much as possible, the human reality beneath the legal categorizations. The women, convicted of adultery in ancient Egypt, were not uniformly guilty by modern standards, or even by honest ancient standards. Egyptian marriage customs give critical context. Girls were typically married at age 12 or 13 to men chosen by their fathers, often men 20 or 30 years older. These marriages were property arrangements. The girl's consent was not sought or required. Once married, she became her husband's legal possession, with fewer rights than he had regarding his own slaves. Some women convicted of adultery had indeed formed relationships with men, not their husbands, often relationships based on mutual affection, in contrast to their arranged marriages. But many others were convicted on evidence that modern legal standards would consider laughably insufficient, speaking to a man at a market, walking alone near a neighbor's house, singing while working in a way that a man might overhear. Egyptian court records from the 19th dynasty document cases where women were convicted of adultery for actions that involve no physical contact and no private conversation, simply because male witnesses testified that the woman had behaved in ways they interpreted as seductive. The legal standard was not, did she commit adultery, but did she create opportunity or appearance of potential adultery? And women convicted of creating appearance faced the same punishments as women caught in actual affairs. Many convictions resulted from false accusations motivated by factors having nothing to do with actual sexual behavior. A husband who wanted to divorce his wife, but did not want to return her dowry, could accuse her of adultery, providing his own slaves as witnesses, and secure both divorce and property retention. A neighbor who coveted a woman's house or possessions could denounce her, knowing that conviction would result in property seizure that might benefit the accuser. A rejected suitor could claim the woman had promised herself to him and then betrayed him with her husband, framing legitimate marriage as adultery through creative testimony. Understanding this context is essential because it reveals that we are not simply examining ancient attitudes towards sexual morality. We are examining how legal systems can be constructed to give institutional legitimacy to systematic male violence against women, how theological frameworks can transform cruelty into righteousness, how entire civilizations can convince themselves that brutality serves justice. Now, let me tell you about the final punishments, the dispositions that ended purification sentences and determined what happened to women's bodies and souls. Egyptian law recognized 3 categories of final punishment for adulteresses, each appropriate to different circumstances. The first and least severe was lifelong temple servitude. Women assigned this punishment were transferred from the house of correction to temple complexes, where they served as the lowest category of worker. They cleaned floors, removed waste, prepared bodies for mummification, and performed every task that Egyptian sensibilities considered polluting. They lived in windowless cells, attached to temple storage areas. They were forbidden to speak, except when directly addressed by priests. They were never permitted to leave temple grounds or have contact with family. Their heads were kept permanently shaved, their bodies marked with the adultery brand refreshed annually to prevent fading. They wore gray linen, a color associated with death and mourning, instead of the white linen worn by respectable women. Most critically, they were forbidden from participating in religious rituals that prepared Egyptians for the afterlife. They could not commission funerary texts. They could not purchase canopic jars or reserve tomb space. When they died, their bodies were not mummified but simply wrapped in plain linen and buried in unmarked graves in the desert beyond temple lands. Egyptian theology held that without proper burial preparation, the soul could not successfully navigate the afterlife journey and would instead wander eternally in the void beyond Ma'at. This was not just life sentence, but eternal sentence. The woman was being punished not just for years, but for all time, across eternity itself. Temple records from Karnak indicate that approximately 40% of convicted adulteresses received this punishment. The average survival time in temple servitude was 7 years, with most dying from untreated infections, accidents during dangerous work, or simply giving up and refusing food until death came as mercy. The second category of final punishment was exile to the mines. Egypt's gold and copper mines in the eastern desert and Sinai operated using convicted criminals as labor. These were not prison work assignments in any modern sense. They were death sentences with extra steps. Women exiled to the mines were chained in groups of 12 and force-marched across the desert to mining camps controlled by military overseers. The journey alone killed approximately 30% of those assigned, with bodies left where they fell and no provision made for burial. Those who survived the journey entered conditions that make modern descriptions of slavery seem inadequate. The mines were deep tunnels carved into rock, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, reaching temperatures that regularly exceeded 130 degrees. Workers labored naked because clothing rotted from sweat and heat within days. They were given water once in the morning and once in the evening, never enough to fully hydrate, creating a constant state of partial dehydration that made thinking clearly impossible. Food consisted of barley meal mixed with water into paste, provided in quantities calculated to keep workers alive but perpetually weak. The work itself involved crawling through tunnels too narrow to stand in, chipping at rock faces with bronze tools in darkness, broken only by occasional oil lamps that produced more smoke than light. The heat was so intense that workers' skin developed burns from touching rock surfaces. The air was so thick with dust that every breath scraped lungs raw. Women worked until they collapsed from heat, injury, or exhaustion. When they collapsed, they were dragged from the tunnels and left in the sun. If they recovered sufficiently to work again, they returned to the mines. If they did not recover within 3 days, they were buried in mass graves near the mining camps. Egyptian records do not track how long individual women survived in mine exile, but archaeological excavations of mining camp burial grounds reveal skeletal remains showing evidence of extreme physical trauma, malnutrition, and death typically occurring within 18 months of arrival. If you are still watching and want me to know you have made it this far into this dark history, comment the number 1 below right now. Your engagement helps ensure that these stories reach more people who need to understand how systems of oppression operated and continue to operate. Every comment matters because it tells the algorithm that this history deserves visibility despite its disturbing content. Approximately 30% of convicted adulteresses were assigned to mine exile. The choice of mines versus temple servitude depended partly on labor needs, mines requiring constant replacement of workers who died faster than they could be replaced through normal criminal sentencing. But it also depended on the specific nature of the adultery. Women who had coupled with men of significantly lower social status were more likely assigned to mines, as were women who had shown defiance during their purification periods or who had attempted escape. The third and final category was public execution. This was reserved for the most serious cases involving women of high status who had committed adultery with partners that created particular scandal or political complication. Egyptian executions for adultery followed specific protocols designed to serve both practical and theological purposes. The woman was not simply killed, but killed in ways that prevented her ba, the soul's mobile aspect, from reuniting with her ka, the soul's life force, in the afterlife. This required destroying the body so completely that reassembly became impossible even through divine intervention. The standard execution method for high-status adulteresses was drowning in the Nile while bound in a weighted sack. This method served multiple purposes simultaneously with characteristic Egyptian efficiency. The Nile was considered sacred, and the god Hapi, who personified the river, was believed to judge those thrown into his waters. If the sack sank quickly, Hapi had accepted the execution as just. The weighted sack prevented the body from floating downstream, where it might be recovered and prepared for burial. And drowning was considered particularly appropriate for adulteresses because it filled the lungs, the organs Egyptians associated with breath and spirit, with water that would prevent the ba from breathing in the afterlife. Executions were public events conducted at dawn from boats anchored in the middle of the river where currents were strongest. The condemned woman was sewn into a linen sack filled with stones heavy enough to overcome the body's natural buoyancy. Before sewing the sack closed, a priest read a formula stating that the woman had violated Ma'at and was being returned to chaos. Then the sack was thrown overboard while crowds watched from both riverbanks. Records from execution observers describe the sack sinking immediately and completely, disappearing beneath the surface within seconds, pulled down by a combination of weight and current. The descriptions include details that suggest some women were still conscious and struggling when sewn into the sacks. The movements visible through the linen as the sack sank, the bubbles rising to the surface for several minutes after submersion. The awful awareness that someone was dying by inches in darkness and water while crowds watched from shore, unable to hear screams muffled by linen and river. Approximately 30% of convicted adulteresses were executed by drowning. The choice of execution over temple servitude or mine exile typically reflected the social prominence of those involved and the political necessity of making a particularly public example. Women whose adultery had become widely known, whose partners were themselves influential, or whose families had enemies seeking to destroy them through scandal, were more likely to be executed rather than assigned to lingering punishments that kept them alive but hidden. Now let me tell you what happened to Hennet Meyer, the woman we met at the beginning, to understand how these systems operated in practice, and how they destroyed not just individual women but entire families. Hennet Meyer's adultery conviction resulted from testimony provided by her husband, Jehudi's younger brother, a man named Amenhotep, who had himself propositioned Henetmeyer repeatedly over the previous 2 years and had been rejected each time. Amenhotep testified before local judges that he had witnessed Henetmeyer meeting secretly with a potter named Nacht, describing specific dates and times when these meetings allegedly occurred. He provided testimony from a slave he owned who claimed to have delivered messages between Henetmeyer and Nacht. He presented a piece of pottery with a love poem scratched into it, claiming he had found it hidden in Henetmeyer's clothing chest. The evidence was entirely fabricated. The meetings Amenhotep described had never occurred. The slave had been beaten until he agreed to provide whatever testimony Amenhotep demanded. The pottery shard with the love poem had been created by Amenhotep himself, copied from a poem he had heard performed at a banquet. But under Egyptian law, the physical evidence and testimony of 2 male witnesses, Amenhotep and his slave, was sufficient for conviction regardless of truth. Henetmeyer was not permitted to testify in her own defense. Nacht the potter was not called as a witness, and in fact knew nothing about the accusation until after Henetmeyer's conviction, when he was himself arrested and executed for adultery with a married woman. His execution was swift, a single sword stroke that ended his life in seconds. The disparity in how male and female adultery were treated appears starkly in this case. Nacht, believed guilty of the same crime as Henetmeyer, died painlessly and quickly. Henetmeyer endured 15 days of systematic torture followed by years of servitude. Jehuti had been unaware of his brother's false accusation until Henetmeyer was arrested. When he learned what Amenhotep had done, he attempted to withdraw the accusation and testify to his wife's innocence. But Egyptian legal procedure did not permit withdrawal of adultery accusations once formal charges had been filed. The judges explained to Jehuti that allowing withdrawals would encourage false accusations by reducing consequences for lying witnesses, and that protecting the integrity of legal procedures required that accusations once made must be prosecuted to conclusion. Jehuti's testimony about Henetmeyer's innocence was ruled inadmissible because, as her husband, he had a conflict of interest that made his testimony unreliable, according to legal standards. The legal system had achieved perfect circularity. A wife accused of adultery could not defend herself because her testimony did not count. Her husband could not defend her because his testimony did not count. No evidence beyond accusation was required, and once accusation was made, no retraction was permitted. Henetmeyer completed her 15 days of purification in the house of correction beneath Karnak Temple. Her nose was destroyed, her face was branded, her back and legs were beaten until walking became agony. She stood in the sun begging for mercy that never came. Then she was assigned to lifelong temple servitude. For the next 9 years, she lived in a windowless cell, performing polluted labor, watching other condemned women arrive, suffer, and die. Her children grew up believing she had died when they were young. Their father remarried 3 years after Henetmeyer's conviction, choosing a much younger wife selected by his brother Amenhotep, who had orchestrated the entire false accusation to make room for a woman he preferred in the family. The children were raised by their stepmother and forbidden to mention their birth mother's name. Within a decade, the younger ones had forgotten what Henetmeyer looked like. The oldest retained fragmentary memories of a woman who had sung while grinding grain, but those memories faded over time until they seemed like dreams rather than actual experiences. Henetmeyer died in her 31st year. Her body was discovered in the temple's waste removal area, where she had collapsed while carrying human waste for disposal. The cause of death was listed in temple records as failure of the heart, which was how Egyptian physicians described any death they could not specifically diagnose. She was wrapped in plain linen and buried in an unmarked grave in the desert beyond temple walls. No ritual was performed. No funerary text was commissioned. No prayer was said for her soul's journey into the afterlife. Her name does not appear in family genealogies. Her existence was erased from the historical record so completely that we know about her only because a protest text written by Jehuti after his wife's conviction was preserved in an archive of disputed legal cases. Jehudi's text argued that the legal system needed reforms to prevent false accusations from destroying innocent women. His arguments were reviewed by temple authorities and rejected. The decision document explained that preventing false convictions was less important than ensuring that actual adulteresses did not escape punishment, and that legal procedures must prioritize certainty of punishment over accuracy of conviction. This reasoning appeared repeatedly in Egyptian legal philosophy. The system was designed to catch all possible guilty parties, even if that meant punishing significant numbers of innocent women. The acceptable error rate was never specified, because Egyptian legal theory held that divine justice would correct any mortal mistakes in the afterlife, where the truly innocent would be vindicated and the truly guilty would be condemned. But Hennetmeyer's story, tragic as it is, represents only one pattern of destruction. Let me tell you about women at the other end of the social spectrum, noble women and princesses whose high status made their punishments both more severe and more politically consequential. In 1318 before the Common Era, a woman named Tawisret faced adultery accusations that would reshape Egyptian dynastic politics for decades. She was the principal wife of Pharaoh Seti II, a woman of royal blood herself, descended from the powerful 19th dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly a century. Tawisret had served as regent during her husband's illness, effectively governing Egypt for 2 years while Seti lay incapacitated by what physicians called the wasting disease, probably cancer. She had managed the kingdom competently, maintaining diplomatic relationships with Hittite allies, overseeing grain distribution during a poor Nile flood, and resolving a border dispute with Libyan tribes. She demonstrated administrative capability that exceeded many of the male pharaohs who preceded and followed her. She understood trade routes, military logistics, temple politics, and agricultural management. She was, by any reasonable measure, qualified to rule. But her exercise of authority threatened powerful priests and nobles who believed that women governing even temporarily violated natural order. When Seti died, his designated heir was a young son from a minor wife, a boy of perhaps 9 years old, named Siptah. Tawisret should have become regent for the child pharaoh, continuing her governance until Siptah reached maturity. But the power faction opposed to female rule needed a way to remove her that would appear legitimate rather than baldly political. The solution was an adultery accusation. A court official named Bey testified that he had personally witnessed Tawisret in intimate embrace with a Syrian administrator named Irsu. Bey provided detailed description of what he claimed to have seen, including time, location, and specific acts performed. He brought forward a servant who claimed to have prepared a bedchamber for Tawisret's meetings with Irsu. He presented jewelry that he claimed Tawisret had given to Irsu as tokens of affection. The accusation was politically brilliant because it was impossible to disprove. Tawisret's position had required her to meet frequently with all senior administrators, including Irsu. She had indeed given gifts to administrators who served competently, following standard protocols for rewarding effective service. She had absolutely met privately with Irsu on numerous occasions to discuss administrative business, as any ruler must meet with their officials. All of the circumstantial evidence Bey presented was factually true. He had simply reinterpreted legitimate governmental activity as romantic affair through the lens of accusation. Tawisret was arrested, tried before a special tribunal of priests, and convicted based on Bey's testimony despite her insistence that her meetings with Irsu had been purely administrative. The political complications of punishing a queen required creative adaptation of standard adultery procedures. Tawisret could not be sent to temple servitude or mine exile because her royal status made such dispositions theologically problematic. She could not be publicly executed because she was still technically royal, and her execution might delegitimize the dynasty itself. Instead, authorities devised a punishment that satisfied both legal requirements and political necessities. Tawisret was confined to a sealed tomb in the Valley of the Queens, alive. This punishment drew on Egyptian funerary traditions, but inverted them into horror. A tomb intended for her eventual burial was completed ahead of schedule. Tawisret was taken there, given a week's worth of food and water, and sealed inside with workers plastering over the entrance and painting it with scenes of her supposed crimes alongside traditional funerary texts. Egyptian theology held that tomb sealing was the beginning of an afterlife journey. Sealing a living person in a tomb created theological ambiguity that served political purposes. Was she alive or dead? Still subject to mortal law, or already transitioning to divine judgment? The answer was deliberately unclear, and this ambiguity allowed Tazret to disappear without creating a clear legal precedent that might threaten other royal women. Tazret survived in her tomb for several months, carving messages into the walls with broken pottery shards. These messages, discovered when the tomb was later reopened, describe her psychological descent as food ran out, as darkness became absolute after lamps consumed all oxygen, as she realized that rescue was not coming. Her final messages alternate between protests of innocence and acceptance of death. The last message she carved reads, "The Syrian did not touch me, but Egypt has consumed me." They call this justice, but the gods see truth. She died from dehydration or starvation, her body eventually mummified by the dry tomb environment. When the tomb was officially opened years later during a broader religious reform, her mummified corpse was removed and reburied in an unmarked location. Her name was chiseled from monuments. Her cartouches were defaced. Her reign as regent was attributed to male advisors in official histories. For 3,000 years, Tawazret existed only as a footnote in dynastic succession lists, a woman who briefly held power between two male pharaohs. Only in the 20th century did archaeological evidence and translation of her tomb messages reveal her actual story and the adultery accusation that destroyed her. The pattern we see in Tawazret's destruction appears repeatedly when we examine how adultery accusations functioned as political tools for removing powerful women from positions of influence. The legal framework and punishment systems created lasting templates that influenced Mediterranean legal traditions for millennia. But let me bring us back from royal politics to the everyday realities of how these systems affected ordinary women. Because for every Tazret destroyed by political machinations, there were thousands of women, like Hennetmeyer, destroyed by mundane cruelties of husbands, neighbors, and legal systems that treated women's bodies as communal property subject to communal regulation. A woman named Mutnofret, age 17, was convicted of adultery in approximately 1200 before the Common Era in the city of Memphis. Her story comes to us through a remarkable document, a petition for mercy written by her mother Neferhetepes, and presented to local judges after Mutnofret's conviction but before her final punishment assignment. The petition survived because it was copied as a training exercise for scribal students, learning how to compose legal documents. According to the petition, Mutnofret was married at age 13 to a potter named Kaimwaset, age 37. The marriage was arranged by Mutnofret's father, who had incurred debts to Kaimwaset and satisfied them by giving his daughter as wife. Kaimwaset was known in Memphis as a violent man. He had been previously married, but his first wife had died under circumstances that neighbors suspected involved beating, though no charges were ever filed because a man disciplining his wife was not illegal under Egyptian law. Mutnofret's married life was brutal from the beginning. Kaimwaset beat her regularly, often severely enough that neighbors could hear her screams through mud brick walls. He forced her to work in his pottery workshop without compensation despite Egyptian law, requiring husbands to provide wives with separate income. He refused to allow her to visit her parents or have any contact with her birth family, isolating her completely within his household where no witnesses could see the full extent of his violence. When Mutnofret became pregnant at age 16, Kaimwaset accused her of infidelity, claiming the child could not be his because he had not had intimate relations with her during the relevant time period. The accusation was absurd. Medical examination by a physician confirmed Mutnofret's pregnancy and estimated she was approximately 4 months along. For Kaimwaset's claim to be true, another man would have had to impregnate her while she was living in total isolation in Kaimwaset's household, with no opportunity to leave or receive visitors without his knowledge. But logic did not matter under Egyptian adultery law. Khaemwaset filed formal charges, testifying that Mutnofret must have coupled with some man he did not know, because the pregnancy proved infidelity and he was certain he had not touched her. Mutnofret testified that Khaemwaset had indeed had intimate relations with her multiple times during the relevant period, that he was certainly the father, and that his accusations stemmed from his desire to rid himself of a wife without returning her dowry or facing social consequences for his violence. The judges faced conflicting testimonies from husband and wife. Under Egyptian law, when testimony conflicted in adultery cases, the husband's version was presumptively credited unless the wife could produce 2 male witnesses to corroborate her account. Mutnofret could not produce such witnesses because Khaemwaset had kept her isolated, and because intimate relations between husband and wife occurred in private without witnesses by definition. She was convicted based solely on her husband's testimony that contradicted biological reality. During her 15-day purification period, Mutnofret miscarried the pregnancy, probably as a result of the beating she received during the marking punishment phase. The miscarriage provided objective evidence that she had indeed been pregnant, which should have supported her testimony that her husband had impregnated her. But by the time the miscarriage occurred, her conviction was already finalized, and Egyptian legal procedure did not permit review of completed cases based on new evidence. Neferhetipes's petition argued that the miscarriage proved Khaemwaset's cruelty, that her daughter had been convicted based on lies, and that justice required either acquittal or at minimum mercy in final sentencing. The judge's response was recorded on the same papyrus as the original petition, providing unusual insight into legal reasoning. They acknowledged that Khaemwaset's testimony might have been false. They noted that the miscarriage timing suggested that severe beating during punishment had caused pregnancy loss. They recognized that Mutnofret might well be innocent, but they ruled that the integrity of legal proceedings required that convictions based on proper procedure could not be overturned, even if doubts arose afterward. They explained that allowing acquittals based on post-conviction evidence would encourage other convicted adulteresses to fabricate new evidence claiming false accusations, undermining all adultery prosecutions. They further reasoned that even if Mutnofret was innocent of adultery, she must have done something to provoke her husband's accusation, and that wives who provoked husbands bore responsibility for consequences. They assigned Mutnofret to lifelong temple servitude. Neferhetipes's petition was denied. Mutnofret served 8 years in temple servitude before dying at age 25. The cause of death is not specified in surviving records, but temple archives note that she was found in her cell having refused food for 10 consecutive days, suggesting suicide by starvation. Even in death, she was denied dignity. Her body was not released to her family for burial, but was wrapped and buried in the temple's designated area for condemned women, an unmarked section of desert where bodies were placed in shallow graves without ceremony or identification. The legal reasoning that refused mercy to Mutnofret appears repeatedly across Egyptian legal texts. The system prioritized its own integrity and procedural correctness over individual justice. This was not accident, but design. Egyptian legal philosophy held that Ma'at, cosmic order, depended on consistent application of law. Individual suffering was unfortunate but acceptable if it maintained systemic order. Protecting innocent women mattered less than ensuring that guilty women could not escape through procedural complications. This calculus made the legal system itself a machine for destroying women, operating according to internal logic that justified any outcome that followed proper procedure. The machine did not care about truth or justice or mercy. It cared about its own operation, its own procedures, its own preservation. Women were fed into this machine and destroyed by it, and the machine's operators genuinely believed they were serving divine justice by maintaining procedural integrity, regardless of the human cost. The medical dimension of adultery punishments deserves specific attention because it reveals how Egyptian physicians became complicit in systematic cruelty. Medical papyri from the New Kingdom contain extensive instructions for treating injuries inflicted during adultery purifications. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, primarily known for its surgical instructions, includes a section on treating brand wounds that specifies keeping wounds open and draining, rather than allowing them to heal cleanly, creating permanent visible scars that would mark the woman for life. The Ebers Papyrus includes formulas for poultices that were applied to wounds from reed beatings. Analysis of these formulas by modern pharmacologists reveals they contained anti-infective properties that would prevent deadly infections from developing. But the formulas do not contain compounds that would promote actual tissue healing. They were designed to keep victims alive, but not to actually heal the damage, ensuring that scars and chronic pain would persist permanently. The most disturbing medical text is a fragmentary papyrus discovered at Deir el-Medina, the village where workers building royal tombs lived. This text, written by a physician named Nebuchadnezzar, describes his experiences treating women in the House of Correction beneath Karnak Temple. Nebuchadnezzar worked there for approximately 12 years during the reign of Ramesses IV, treating wounds, monitoring health, and determining when women had recovered sufficiently from one punishment phase to begin the next. His text is clinical, describing injuries with the same detached precision he used for any medical observation: fractures resulting from falls during exposure purification, infections developing in brand wounds despite treatment, psychological deterioration manifesting as refusal to eat or speak. He documents everything with the careful attention of a physician trained to observe and record without emotional involvement. But between the clinical descriptions are passages where his discomfort becomes visible through the papyrus's formulaic language. He writes about a woman who begged him to let her die rather than continue suffering. He describes his own nightmares after particularly severe cases. He mentions that other physicians refused assignments to the House of Correction, creating staffing shortages that extended his own service period beyond what he had agreed to. And he asks, in a passage that seems to be wrestling with his own conscience, whether physicians who preserve life in order to extend suffering are actually fulfilling their healing oath or violating it. The question he posed has no comfortable answer. His participation kept women alive through torment they might have preferred to escape through death. But refusing participation would not have ended the torments, only ensured that less skilled practitioners administered them, probably resulting in more deaths from untreated infections and uncontrolled complications. Nebuchadnezzar was trapped in a system that made ethical behavior impossible. Whatever choice he made involved complicity in cruelty. His text survived because it was buried in his tomb, possibly because he wanted some record of what he had witnessed and participated in, possibly because he thought future generations might understand his impossible position better than his contemporaries could. The text provides unique insight into how intelligent, educated people became complicit in systematic atrocity. Nebuchadnezzar was not a monster. He was a skilled physician who spent his career healing people and saving lives. Yet for 12 years he used that skill to keep women alive specifically so they could be tortured more extensively. He struggled with what he was doing. He questioned it. He had nightmares about it. But he continued doing it, day after day, year after year, because the system was bigger than individual conscience, and because refusing would have cost him his position, his reputation, possibly his life. His complicity was not simple evil, but the ordinary functioning of systems that distribute responsibilities so widely that no individual feels fully accountable for outcomes that require many people's cooperation to achieve. Now, let me connect these historical atrocities to modern patterns, because the techniques developed for controlling female sexuality in ancient Egypt did not disappear 3,000 years ago. They evolved, spread, and persist in forms we must recognize to combat. The fundamental logic underlying Egyptian adultery law appears throughout history and across cultures. Women's bodies are property subject to male control. Female sexual autonomy threatens social order. Systems must exist to violently suppress that autonomy and make examples of women who claim it. Roman law adapted Egyptian punishments directly. The Justinian Code, compiled in the 6th century and influential in European law for the next 1,000 years, drew explicitly on Egyptian precedent in treating adultery as primarily female crime punishable through public humiliation and bodily mutilation. Medieval European law continued the tradition. Women convicted of adultery faced brandings, public whippings, and confinement in convents under conditions intentionally brutal, all practices traceable to Egyptian models, transmitted through Roman and Byzantine legal frameworks. The innovation of honor killings, where families murdered women accused of sexual impropriety, emerged partly from legal traditions that treated female sexuality as family property, whose damage justified violent response. When a woman's value is understood to derive from her sexual purity, and that purity is treated as belonging not to her but to her family, then violation of that purity becomes theft, requiring violent punishment. This logic dominates in Egyptian law and continues operating in modern contexts. In contemporary times, we see the patterns persist with minimal adaptation. Forced marriage to rapists, legally permitted in multiple countries, follows the Egyptian principle that a woman who has been sexually compromised must be controlled by the man who compromised her. Honor violence, where women are killed for perceived sexual transgressions, replicates the Egyptian execution model of destroying women whose sexuality threatens family status. Acid attacks, targeting women's faces, echo the Egyptian branding practice of marking female transgressors permanently to ensure their crimes remain visible. Let me give you specific statistics that illustrate modern persistence of these ancient patterns. As of 2025, 20 countries maintain laws specifically criminalizing adultery. In 12 of those countries, the penalty applies only to women, or applies much more harshly to women than to men, directly replicating the Egyptian gender asymmetry, where male sexual behavior was ignored, while female sexual behavior was cosmic crime. In 8 countries, women can still be sentenced to death by stoning for adultery. The method, burying a woman to her waist and throwing stones until she dies, deliberately prolongs suffering and involves community in punishment, exactly as Egyptian exposure purification required public witness to female suffering. In 15 countries, laws explicitly excuse or reduce penalties for men who kill female relatives accused of dishonoring families through sexual behavior. These honor-killing provisions descend directly from legal principles first articulated in ancient Egyptian law codes. Worldwide, an estimated 5,000 women are killed annually in honor killings, with the actual number likely much higher because many cases go unreported or are disguised as accidents or suicides. Each killing follows the same logic Heinetmeyer faced. A woman violated sexual norms. Her violation threatened family status. Her death was necessary to restore that status. The specifics differ, but the pattern remains constant across 3,000 years. The World Health Organization estimates that 35% of women globally experience physical or sexual violence from intimate partners. Egyptian law treated wives as husbands' property, subject to correction through violence. Contemporary domestic violence follows the same pattern of ownership and control, with violence serving to enforce compliance with male authority over female bodies and behavior. In countries where women's testimony is weighted less than men's in legal proceedings, where women cannot travel or work without male guardian permission, where women who report rape face prosecution for adultery if they cannot prove non-consent, we see Egyptian legal principles operating in modern legal systems. The architecture of control has been preserved across millennia with remarkable consistency. Now let me return to Heinetmeyer one final time to understand how individual lives were destroyed within these systems, and why remembering specific victims matters more than just understanding abstract patterns. Heinetmeyer entered the House of Correction as a woman with an identity, a person with relationships and skills and dreams that mattered to her as much as yours mattered to you. She was a mother who loved her children desperately. She sang to them at night, traditional songs her own mother had taught her. She taught her eldest daughter the textile patterns that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. She dreamed of seeing her son become a scribe like his father, rising in status through education. She was a skilled textile worker whose cloth was sought after by merchants. She had spent years perfecting techniques for dyeing linen in complex patterns. She took pride in her work, in the beauty she created with her hands. She had friends in her neighborhood, women she had known since childhood. They gathered to grind grain together, turning tedious work into social time. They shared problems and advice and gossip that made daily life bearable. All of that was taken from her through a legal process that treated her existence as disposable. Her children were told she was dead and eventually believed it, because how could they not when years passed with no word, no visit, no sign she still existed? Her textile work was attributed to other weavers, because condemned women could not own property or be credited for labor. Her friends stopped mentioning her name for fear that association with a convicted adulteress would bring suspicion on themselves. Her dreams became irrelevant the moment accusation transformed her from person into legal category. She spent 9 years performing polluted labor in a windowless cell, 9 years without sunlight or fresh air or human kindness, 9 years of hunger and pain and isolation that ground away everything that had made her herself. 9 years watching other women arrive, suffer, and die in cells around hers, knowing that she was witnessing her own future. 9 years knowing that her innocent existence had been stolen through lies, and that the justice system cared more about its own procedures than about her truth. When she collapsed while carrying waste and died on a stone floor in a service corridor, no one recorded her final moments. Did she know she was dying? Did she feel relief that it was finally ending? Did she think of her children in her last seconds? Did she pray to gods who had abandoned her? We will never know. Egyptian record-keeping did not consider the final thoughts of condemned women worth documenting. No one mourned her loss publicly. Her husband mourned in secret, but public mourning for a convicted adulteress would have brought suspicion and social consequences. Her children were not told when she died, because officially she had died years earlier when arrested. Her friends learned of it through rumor, but did not attend any burial because there was no burial to attend. Just a body wrapped in cloth and placed in desert sand without ceremony or marker. Hennet was erased so completely that even basic details of her existence come to us only through the protest text her husband wrote, a text that was itself preserved accidentally. Everything we know about Hennet fits on a single sheet of papyrus. Her entire life, her suffering, her death, her erasure, reduced to a few paragraphs in an administrative archive that survived 3,000 years through chance rather than intention. And she represents thousands of other women whose stories were successfully erased, who suffered and died without leaving even the fragmentary record that preserved Henutmir's name. For every woman whose name we recover from historical silence, hundreds remain unknowable. They are the absences in family genealogies where a wife's name should appear but doesn't. The gaps in property records showing transfers that make no sense until you realize a woman was removed from the family. The ambiguous references in legal texts to usual penalties applied without specifying what those penalties were. They were real people who experienced real suffering. They were mothers and daughters and sisters whose loss devastated families even when that devastation could not be publicly acknowledged. They were workers who contributed to their communities through skills that were never credited to them after conviction. They had hopes and fears and dreams that mattered to them as much as yours matter to you. They died badly, broken by systems that treated their breaking as righteous. And they were deliberately erased from historical memory because the authorities who destroyed them did not want future generations to know what had been done in Ma'at's name. Our responsibility now is remembering them even when we cannot name them, acknowledging that Egyptian civilization's achievements were built partly on systematic destruction of women who claimed bodily autonomy, recognizing that legal systems can transform cruelty into procedure and procedure into righteousness while destroying lives with bureaucratic efficiency. Understanding that the patterns of control developed 3,000 years ago persist today and must be actively resisted. These stories matter because they are true, and because truth matters even when uncomfortable. They matter because the victims deserved better than what they received. They matter because historical erasure of atrocity is its own atrocity, compounding original harm through denial. They matter because recognizing patterns of gendered violence across history helps us identify those patterns in contemporary contexts where they continue to operate. For Hennetmeyer, age 22, falsely convicted, tortured for 15 days, enslaved for 9 years, buried in unmarked grave. For Mutnofret, age 17, murdered by a legal system protecting her abusive husband. For Tawazret, powerful queen destroyed by political enemies who weaponized adultery law against her effective governance. For all the named women, and for all the unnamed women whose existence was erased so thoroughly we will never know even their names. They survived impossible things as long as survival was possible. Some resisted to the end. All deserved to live in a world that treated them as human beings rather than as property. Their suffering was not necessary, despite what the judges claimed. Their punishments did not serve cosmic order. Their destruction did not protect Ma'at. They were murdered by legal systems that gave institutional legitimacy to systematic male violence against women. And we remember them now because they were real, and their suffering was real, and because refusing to forget is the minimum respect we owe to people who were deliberately erased. This is the history that Egyptian civilization tried to hide beneath 3,000 years of sand and selective record-keeping. This is what happens when legal systems treat women's bodies as property and female autonomy as cosmic violation. This is why we must keep telling these stories even when they are difficult and disturbing. Subscribe to this channel if you want more hidden histories exposed. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how systems of oppression operated and continue to operate. These stories matter because they reveal patterns of control that persist today. These voices deserve to be heard because silence enabled their destruction, and continued silence enables modern destruction. The ruins of Egyptian temples still stand, visited by millions of tourists who walk the same ground where women were systematically tortured. The House of Correction exists beneath Karnak Temple, closed to tourists but physically present, its walls still marked by the iron rings that held victims immobile. These places remember even if modern visitors do not know what happened there. Understanding these women helps us recognize when contemporary legal systems operate on the same principles, helps us identify when violence against women is being institutionalized under claims of protecting morality or social order, helps us see that civilization's heights can coexist with civilization's depths, and that celebrating ancient achievements requires also acknowledging ancient atrocities. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And remember, every time you engage with this content, every time you comment or share, you are helping ensure that these voices reach people who need to hear them. These forgotten women deserve to have their suffering acknowledged. And there are so many more stories waiting to be told.